start. So for those of you that are new to debate, the thing that I want you to take away the most from this round is just watching what you're supposed to do during a debate round. If you are able to follow along the arguments, that's awesome, but I know that the instructors here that are going to debate are also going to show you some of the best behaviors that debaters do that you can bring to debate rounds when you are in them. But I also want you to take a look at the ballot that you have, because everybody in this room will be making a decision on this round, and the two things that you are asked to give comments on is your who won the debate round, meaning the team. And we have the affirmative team on your right. So it's Joyce and Aaron. And we have the negative team on your left. We have Amit and Saya. And you also get to choose who the best speaker of the round is. And so paying attention to a lot of different things. You've got Tupac, but you also should pay attention to, did this person forget to cover an argument? Or, Saya. So it's not just how this person speaks, how eloquent they are, but also like how they move the round along is another part of judging a debate who is the best speaker. And if you notice, both of the things that I'm asking you to vote on ask you for reasons why. For the team that won, you have to put an RFD. That is something that you should look for on every ballot you get, and that's the reason for decision. You have to explain why you thought that this team did a better debating, and then you also have to tell us why you think that speaker did the best speaking. The person that did the best speaking can come from the team that lost the debate round. So just to FYI, you don't have to be the best speaker to win the debate round. It can happen in policy debate where you are an excellent speaker, but yet the other team had a better debate round overall. So you'll bring these back to your instructors, and I want to know from the instructors later on who collectively we thought won or lost this debate round. And the other thing that is going to be awesome for this round is Elysia is going to be flowing the round and emceeing the round. So helping us walk through the debate and showing us some of their flows during the debate itself. So you can sort of gather along or come along. But if you are flowing this round and you're getting a little frustrated because it's hard to keep up with, just take a breather and try to catch up when you can. Don't fully give up, because that means that it'll be really hard to determine who won the round and who you thought did the best speaking. And if you're actually in a debate round and you get lost within the debate round, it's a good way to practice trying to stay with the debate, so you don't just like give up and say like, well, whatever, it's okay. Question?
I didn't know that judges had to give an RFD.
Judges should give an RFD. Not all judges do, but judges also are on a debate learning journey for the most part. So it's something that as you grow as debaters and become judges, you should give an RFD when you are judging. It helps the debaters figure out what they need to do next, and it also helps the coaches help guide debaters to their future debate selves. So you will be a wonderful crop of judges in the future when you are judging middle school rounds when you're in high school. So any other questions before we start? All right, so the other thing to note is this round is a shortened round. We are condensing it because we know attention spans on a rainy day is hard. The constructive speeches are only 2 minutes long. The rebuttals are 1.5 minutes. Yeah. And the cross-ex is 1 minute. And so they're not going to have as much time in the debate round as you will when you're debating. So it's going to seem very shortened, very condensed, but that's also because we only want to keep you in this space for a shortened amount of time. So pay attention. It's going to go lightning quick because it's a half debate round, essentially, in terms of the time that we're allowing them. All right, that's it. I'm going to turn it over to the debaters and to Elysia to MC and let us see beautiful flows throughout the debate. I'm excited to see all of the best debater behavior I can.
Hello, everyone. Greetings. My partner and I propose the following plan. The United States federal government to substantially increase the security cooperation with the North Atlantic Treaty Organization to fully fund and support pandemic response and prevention programs under Article 3 of the Washington Treaty. Contention 1 is inherency. NATO is not prepared for the next pandemic. It lacks funding and capacity to manage future crises. Denial 20. Given the impact of COVID, it was paramount for NATO to protect its member states. The Operations Division has admitted that the alliance was ill-prepared to handle such a crisis. Next, contention 2 is solvency. NATO programs are critical to pandemic prevention, but status quo support fails. Only the plan revitalizes NATO and prevents future crises. Levy 21. SDO should push for funding for biomedical research and pathogen surveillance. SPS should invest in global antimicrobial resistance and biosecurity stockpiles. IRDAC should expand its role in international cooperation. NATO is well positioned to make resilience a reality. Next is the disease advantage. First, disease outbreaks are inevitable. Only investment in public health can prevent the next pandemic and save millions of lives. Rogers 22. We live in an age of pandemics, and this risk has been increasing. Investments is key to ending that cycle so that outbreaks don't become pandemics. Next, NATO investment under Article 3 solves. Preparation for the next pandemic is key. Levy 21. Focus on resilience can prevent the next crisis. Article 3 supports multiple programs to build resilience against non-traditional threats. And finally, pandemic prevention is key to racial justice. Systemic racism means people of color are uniquely at risk. Wave 20. Crises play out along the fault lines of society. In New York, Latino and Black people have been twice as likely to die from COVID as white people. Get ready for cross-examination.
Excellent. Your levy evidence is from before Russia started their aggression against Ukraine. How has that changed NATO's priorities in terms of whether they're focused on responding to the pandemic or responding to military crises?
It has not changed their position. NATO is both capable of supporting their deterrence capabilities while also providing additional assistance towards pandemic prevention.
Okay.
So our evidence talks about...
Oh, sorry, I had another question.
Mm-hmm.
Your impact is about being able to mitigate racial injustice due to like inequalities in healthcare. How is NATO the best option to address that?
So referring back to our Levy 21 evidence insolvency, there are several different programs that allow NATO specific access or unique qualities to help these communities. So they are able to mobilize their troops to deliver resources and have this research for biomedical purposes.
Thank you.
All right, so some things that we might have noticed in cross-ex are both the person asking the questions and answering were looking forward at you all, the judges, and not at each other, which is something that we do in debate because we're trying to persuade the judge. We're always going to be looking at the judge in cross-ex, so it might feel weird to be talking to someone and not looking at them, but that's pretty normal in debate. The other thing is that, everyone's pretty polite. So, even when it's like, hey, I need you to stop talking because I have a question, it's like, done in a polite way where it's like, oh, thank you, sorry, I have another question. So even in debate, even though we're arguing with each other, we're still being very civil about it. Now, we're about to go into the 1NC, and Christy told you all you might need 2 sheets of paper. So this is the part where we're going to start using the second sheet of paper. So what we're going to do is you're going to hear the disadvantage first, the deterrence disadvantage, and you're going to flow that on your new piece of paper in your first column. And then once Amit leaves the disadvantage and goes on to the case, which is what Joyce was just talking about in the 1NC, we're going to switch papers and start flowing in the 1NC column on our flow that we already started. So does that sound okay for everyone? Yeah. All right. And then we can take a look at what that looks like after this speech.
All right, is everyone ready?
Yeah.
On your second sheet. Can everyone hear me okay? Right. Disadvantage is deterrence. First is uniqueness. NATO defense spending is on the brink. Overstretching budgets will wreck the alliance. Las Conjurias 2022. When it comes to defense, most European nations are not considering to diminish their investment. The years between 2008 and 2012 resulted in cutbacks in budgets. Further cutbacks would deal a fatal blow to Europe's capacity for collective action. Second is the link. Expanding NATO's mission to include public health trades off with deterrence. Sassaroli 2022. NATO's involvement in health crises might drain resources and take them out of most urgent situations. NATO already has a lot in its plate. Diversion of efforts may be counterproductive. Third is the internal link. NATO defense spending is key to deter war with Russia. Kochis 22. Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine should put to rest questions about the modern utility of the alliance. NATO must signal that it is strengthening in response to Russia. Russia's ongoing actions to cleave Ukraine exemplify the need for the alliance to bolster deterrence. Fourth is the impact. War with Russia goes nuclear. Only NATO can save us from World War III. Schlosser 2022. Russia invaded a country, threatened nuclear attacks, and committed acts of nuclear terrorism. A Russian attack on a NATO country could be the beginning of World War III. On to the case. First, the status quo solves. We're already prepping for the next pandemic. Schreiber 22. Officials and researchers are looking to the next pandemic. A new disease forecasting center aims to prepare for the next big outbreak. Second, NATO pandemic response fails. They can't even protect themselves. Shea 2020. The military have proven no more resilient to coronavirus than the civilian population. A US carrier is out of action in Guam with a crew of 4,000 stricken with the virus. A Dutch submarine has had to return home, and 2 German corvettes have stopped operation. Navies seem to be particularly vulnerable to diseases. Ready for crossers?
So first, your shrivel evidence talks about how we're already preparing for the next pandemic. What steps are being taken?
Well, as I mentioned, there is a new center that is being set up under the purview of the CDC, and that center is aiming to prepare for the next big outbreak. Our public officials in general...
Has it already been built?
It is currently in the process of being created. We are still getting out of the current pandemic, but the infrastructure is being set up.
Okay. What is deterrence?
Deterrence is essentially being able to create a military that is strong enough together as NATO to stop Russia, in this case, from being able to attack further.
So would you say deterrence is partially signaling, like we have to show that we are a bigger power?
Yes.
So if the U.S. is the #1 military holder, what more does NATO or does the U.S. need to invest in to make sure that the deterrence is still strong?
We need to invest in showing that we are going to work together with our European allies. The U.S. alone is not enough of deterrence, but the U.S. with many countries is deterrence.
Thank you.
Awesome.
So now we're going to hear from Aaron. So again, we have 2 sheets of paper. So this time, you're going to notice that whenever the affirmative is speaking, the case is going to come first, and then the disadvantage, and then it's going to be the opposite with the negative. So I want everyone to get their case flows ready, so the ones that we pulled out in the 1AC, and then put the one that you just started, this speech, under it. And then I just want to show you my case flow real quick, because you all are probably going to hear a few things like the word overview, and all right, as soon as this wants to show my flow. But y'all are going to hear reference to an overview, which is where y'all will hear some summary of the arguments, some Mr. T, and then you all will also hear line-by-line arguments. So this is where we want to kind of start looking at what Amit said in the 1NC on the case and kind of line up Aaron's responses next to those things. Looks like we'll figure out how to show the flows later in this debate. Oh, wait.
Is it on the right input?
It should be, it's on HTML.
Is there a document camera?
This is the document.
Yay!
Technology.
Yeah. All right. So here's my case flow. I'm doing it. It looks red or orange, but I'm doing it in pink and purple. All right. So we've got our 1AC here. We've got our 2 1NC responses to the case here. So when we hear Aaron do line by line on the case, we might hear a response to 1NC1, or they said status quo solved, and then we're going to put our responses next to it here in our 2AC column. And then when Aaron goes to making a response about the dissent, we're going to switch papers, and we're going to come over to this new piece of paper that we just started. So does everyone feel good about being able to switch papers, but in the opposite direction this time? All right, do we have a question? Yep, okay, so here's our case flow. Don't worry about making sure you copy down all the arguments perfectly. Just, as long as y'all are getting something down and keeping track of, which speech it's in, that's enough. But yeah, so we know there were 2 arguments on the case in the 1NC. So we're going to hear Aaron specifically indicate when they're responding to each of those arguments from the 1NC. And you might hear multiple answers to one argument from the 1NC. So if you can keep track of that, super awesome. If not, that's okay. This is a skill that we practice, and I've had over 10 years to practice this skill. All right, we ready to try flow in the 2AC, everyone? All right.
Is anybody not good? Cool. Pandemics outweigh. 1 is magnitude. Pandemics hamstring effective deterrence by shredding institutional capacity in military, which means we comparatively outweigh on scope. 2 is risk. COVID proves a high propensity for new pathogens to arise. 3 is time frame. Globalizing and COVID proved pandemic spread is extremely rapid. 1NC1, status quo doesn't solve. 1EC levy indicates that killer pathogens are inevitable. It's just a question of global collective responses, which currently do not exist. 1NC shivers about the US handling code and doesn't even say it'll solve anything or that the projects have finished. 1NC2, apps solved. Increased funding, focus, and technical innovation ensures pandemic and prevention strategies that solve current issues. That's the 1NC levy evidence. The 1NC evidence doesn't assume the act takes place. The dissent. First, disease outweighs war. The benefits of the plan are greater than the cost. Lodovico and Savedi 22. Immediate action is critical. Infectious diseases generate devastation in any war. The impacts of annual infections eclipse wars. The cost of crisis response exceeds that of building resilient health systems for pandemic preparedness. Second, no link. NATO pandemic response does not trade off with deterrence. Jovic Lezic 21. NATO's pandemic response policy does not jeopardize effective deterrence. Missions critical to the alliance's security are fully staffed and focused. It was critical to demonstrate to allies its capabilities to fight against COVID. Third, no impact. Putin won't risk nuclear escalation with the West. Vershbo and Lodal 22. Probability is very low. Putin's saber rattling aimed at deterring the US. Putin is unlikely to do so. This would galvanize a harsh US response without providing significant military advantage. Risk of uncontrolled escalation by being the first to break the nuclear taboo. Nuclear deterrence works in Cuba, Korea, and in Vietnam. Fourth is no link. Regardless of NATO, Russia is still deterred by US military spending and our comparatively larger army. Fifth is no internal link. NATO failure to respond to Ukraine with force means our entire deterrence posture and perception of NATO as a strong power is inevitably shot. I'm good for press.
Good for press, okay. All right, first you stated that there are no global response mechanisms to the pandemic. What about the WHO and other organisms that did do that in this past pandemic?
Well, we don't think those are effective. The WHO was a little bit laughable during COVID because they had a lot of proposals, and they are essentially a relatively toothless organization.
And then follow up, what makes NATO any better than that as an organization that's military?
Because NATO isn't toothless, it has resources and actual personnel that it can deploy, institutions and money that it can devote to actual research and military responses.
So you specifically use the word global as something we need, but NATO isn't global. NATO only covers Western Europe and North America. So how would that address perceived need that you mentioned?
Well, you could say that the U.S. is only domestic, but the problem with that argument is that all of our vaccines and a ton of the research that we do also spreads to the rest of most of the global South. Even countries like India and China are developing vaccines based on Western tech.
But you mentioned NATO as using security capacities and military capacities. That specifically only applies to the countries that it is protecting. NATO does not have any obligation to protect.
Well, you can do HATR in the South China Sea.
Thank you.
All right. All right, so Here's my case flow from the 2AC. We can see that, you know, up top I flowed the stuff from the overview, so this is where we saw our Mr. T that we talked about. So comparing the impacts of the affirmative case and the negative disadvantage. So we had arguments about outweighing on magnitude, risk, and time frame. And then here I used a line to kind of indicate which things Aaron's arguments were responding to from the 1NC. So we had both extensions of evidence from the 1AC and attacks on the 1NC evidence. And then on the disadvantage flow, we just introduced some new arguments, and we don't have to worry about lining those up just yet. But, so, were people able to keep up okay with the idea? Able to tell when Aaron was specifically responding to certain things from the case? Yeah. So we're about to see the same thing happen on the disadvantage with the negative. However, this is going to be a little bit funky because now we are into a part of the debate called the negative block. So you all probably noticed we've been going back and forth between the affirmative and the negative, but now the negative is going to get two speeches back to back. So Saya is going to have the 2NC and then get processed, and then Amit is going to have the 1NR, and then Joyce in the 1AR will have to respond to all of that in one speech. So the negative block is something that we can think of kind of like being as one big long speech. So if you all look at my flow and kind of the way we've been telling you all to label your flows throughout the week, you'll notice that we've been saying all week 2NC/1NR in one column, and that's why, because we're going to treat this like one long speech. What you all are going to see Saya and Amit do is something called splitting the block, which means that only one of them is going to talk about the disadvantage, and only one of them is going to talk about the case. So I'm just going to spoil it for you now. Saya is going to talk about the disadvantage. So for this next speech, we're only going to need this piece of paper. We're going to be able to, we're going to see some of the same stuff we saw in the 2AC on the case, where there's going to be an overview with Mr. T. There's going to be responses to the specific arguments that Aaron made in the 2AC. And then there's going to be nothing in the 2NC about the case. So nothing about solvency, harms, inherency. And then when Amit gets to the 1NR, he's only going to talk about the case, and we're not going to hear anything about the deterrence disadvantage. So everyone get your negative disadvantage flows ready, and get ready for just a lot of hearing from the negative. All right, do we have any questions or confusion before we jump into the negative blocks? No? All right.
Okay, we all ready to go? Nice. Okay. On the overview, the impact of the disadvantage outweighs the affirmative. First is magnitude. The impact of the disadvantage is nuclear war. This will affect far more people than the affirmative's impact of racism or disease. Racism is a real and serious problem, and so is COVID. But if we all die in a nuclear war, we will never have the opportunity to combat either of those. Nuclear war is the fastest impact. Racism and COVID and disease are both slow impacts. While they're currently happening, the world is already cooperating to solve for pandemics, and racism is going to take a long time to combat. While the plan will immediately damage mutually assured destruction, and that means that we will escalate to nuclear war very quickly. The risk is uniquely high now, according to our Schlosser evidence. Russia has already committed acts of nuclear terrorism during the ongoing invasion of Ukraine, so the risk of nuclear war is uniquely high now. They say the impact is bigger from disease, but this is not taking into account Russia war. This is talking about conventional wars in the past. If the war escalates to nuclear war, then the impact will be bigger than anything else, because nuclear war will trigger escalation, which will lead to nuclear winter, which will wipe out all life on Earth. They say that they don't trade off with deterrence, but the trade-off is specific to now and the unique need for NATO to be high. Extend our Cessaloli evidence. Their evidence is outdated because it's from 2021, before NATO's full power was needed to deter Russia from their continued invasion of Eastern Europe. They say there's no impact, but their evidence is from May 10th, before the nuclear taboo was broken by Putin shelling different areas that had nuclear facilities in them, which means that he is completely willing to do incredible amounts of damage that nobody has done before. They say deterrence is only necessary from the US, but we need to show commitment to our allies. NATO is weak now, and that's from our Las Conjurias evidence. They say that they can't solve without pandemic response, but we can respond in other ways. More of that will be on the case.
Saya, you good for press?
Yes.
Awesome. All right, I want to talk about your COCHIS evidence. The one internal link you have is from the Heritage Foundation, which gets money from arms dealers. Do you think there's some conflict of interest here with the propensity for warmongering and the necessity for, the need for military buildup?
I mean, sure, in that there's obviously like conflicts of interest, but everybody is getting money from someone, and also the examples that they cite.
Disingenuous.
The examples that they cite are good enough that they provide good warrants for.
Yeah, okay, let's talk about that card a little bit more. It says that the way we prevent a war with Russia is by an alliance-wide recommitment to defense, U.S. presence in Eastern Europe, updated operational planning, and continued naval presence in Europe. Where in the SQUO is any of that happening?
Yeah, so the argument is that the U.S. is recommitting to those things with the threat of Russia, but that
Wait, your argument is that the U.S. is recommitted to those things.
Well, that the U.S. is recommitting to NATO, which is recommitting to those things. And that if the U.S. switches our focus with NATO to disease, that'll hurt that.
All right, I'm doing the 1 NR now, which is only case, so you switch back to your other sheet of paper. I'm not going to be talking about the disadvantage at all.
Yeah, sorry.
Ready?
Yeah, okay.
1 second, sorry.
The affirmative case fails to solve pandemics, meaning that, Judge, you should only look at the impact, magnitude, and risk as outlined in our disadvantage because they cannot access the MRT of their advantage. And here is why. First, they mentioned that solving public health and investing in public health is the only way to move forward on addressing the pandemic. However, NATO is not a credible public health institution. It is a military institution. Our status quo that we outlined solves much better. A program is being funded under the CDC, as mentioned in our Schreiber 2022 evidence, that is actually focused on public health to help address the pandemics. Next, we move to their racism advantage as part of their case. They cannot solve that either because they want to focus on racism as it applies in the American context. NATO, as an international organization, cannot credibly solve this issue compared to our status quo. The CDC, in the domestic context of the United States, can much better solve the effects of the pandemic within the U.S. and address the issues of racism within our borders. Furthermore, they talked about needing a global focus to addressing further pandemics. NATO does not provide said global focus. NATO focuses on Western Europe and North America, and that furthermore may play and turn their racism advantage, as they are ignoring countries in Africa and Asia that can be affected by pandemics just as strongly to prioritize protecting Western countries using military might to solve pandemics. The only reason NATO was able to do some addressing of the COVID pandemic is because they diverted assets and military equipment away from their power of deterrence. We need to focus on deterrence in the future. Thank you.
Alright, so was everybody able to keep everything on 2 separate sheets of paper for these speeches? That's okay. I heard I messed up. That's okay. Blowing is super hard and it's really easy to make mistakes, but that doesn't mean that we give up. It just means that we keep going. Maybe we talk to our partners and say, hey, did you catch this? But that's totally okay. Is that a question in the back? Just a stretch? Okay. Yeah, Olivia, do you have a question? Yes, those are continents. But
I
yeah.
apologize. That was a mistake.
Alright. Does anyone have any questions about
in Africa?
Oh,
Yeah.
I think that is what I said.
countries in Africa and Asia? Do we have any clear questions about kind of like what has happened in the debate so far or what's about to happen? Okay, so I'm gonna show y'all my flows real quick. So y'all will be able to see that even though we only have one column, I'm able to, on both of these, keep the arguments separate because Amit only talked about the case and Saya only talked about the disadvantage, so even though we only have the one column for both speeches, it's kind of like we are only just flowing one long speech that addressed both. So we once again had some Mr. T on the disadvantage. We had some explicit responses where Saya would say, they said this, but, and that was our kind of indicator of where we should be flowing everything, about like where we should be flowing, that there's a trade-off. Oh, also, I just want to point out to y'all real quick, I don't catch everything either. Like, see, here I'm just like, the year's 2021, here it was Ludovico and someone else, I don't know. You don't have to catch every detail, that's okay. Even if you have a lot of experience, you're not going to be perfect. But the thing that we're going to do now is have the 1AR. So all of this stuff that we just caught in the negative block, Joyce is going to have to respond to. So once again, you all should expect that we're going to start on the case. We're going to hear a little bit more about Mr. T at the very beginning. And then Joyce is going to explicitly respond to the things that Amit said in the 1NR. And then we're going to switch our papers. We're going to go on to the deterrence disadvantage. And then you all are probably going to notice Aaron made 5 arguments against the disadvantage in the 2AC. Joyce is not going to extend all 5 of those arguments. They're only going to pick the best ones so that, you know, the big thing about the 1AR is that you are pressed for time. So you don't want to just try to win everything. You want to say, what are our best arguments, and go for those. So against, on the case, they have to win everything because they have to be able to prove that they can solve their harms. But against the disadvantage, they only need to win one really good argument. So get ready for some line by line on the case, but just looking for 1 or 2 key arguments being extended on the disad.
Is everybody ready? We went on risk and time frame. Marginalized communities are dying and still impacted by COVID right now. And future marginalized communities will be severely impacted shortly if we don't act on the plan. They cannot win on magnitude because their cards just say war, not nuclear war. This is the only thing you should vote on because it's the only thing happening right now. And we outweigh and turn their disadvantage. The increase in outbreaks decreases the number of troops and increases bad communication and anxiety, which leads to mistakes, which can lead to war. On to the line by line. First, we do solve. Their card is only about the U.S. and what the CDC can do. Our plan helps marginalized communities across the globe because of NATO's reach, which is what we explained in our levy evidence. 2, they say NATO can't solve in this flow, but 1, we're going to extend our levy evidence again. U.S. resources can be deployed, and there's 30 members. There's the reach that NATO has is incredible. It can reach to every reach of the globe. Okay. 2, there's a new flood of money because of the Ukraine crisis, and B, there's STO, there's SPS, there's the NATO Pandemic Response Trust Fund. There's resources right now that we can improve on. On to the disadvantage. Their evidence is biased, and that was proven from the cross-sects. We're going to extend our leak evidence that talks about how it is important that NATO has there is no trade-off because NATO is able to have proper deterrence because of the signaling that we have.
All right, so as we just saw, Joyce responded to everything that Amit said about the status quo solving, about NATO not being able to solve. We got more Mr. T, where we had arguments about risk and time frame, outweighing, and why we shouldn't vote on magnitude. And then on the disadvantage, we just had 1 argument. We just had that no link argument extended. In case you all didn't catch that earlier debate, that was the 2nd argument in the 2AC against the disadvantage. So that argument got extended. The rest of them, the negative team doesn't have to worry about answering. So when Saya is trying to answer everything in the 2NR on the disad, they just have to focus on that 1 no link argument. Does that make sense to everyone? Yeah. So we're going to get into our last speeches now, and I'm not going to jump back up between the 2NR and the 2AR, but our final speakers have the job of essentially reminding us with Mr. T why their impact is the most important, why voting for them or not voting for them and voting for the other team is going to cause all of the bad things that they talk about, and try to extend whatever their single best argument against the other team is. So the negative is going to try to win every part of the disadvantage and extend 1 really good argument against the case, and then the affirmative team is going to try to win all of the parts of the case and extend 1 really good argument. We know from the 1AR is going to be that no link argument against the disadvantage. So kind of like what Joyce did in the 1AR, but they have more time because they're not answering 2 speeches back to back. All right, so does everyone feel ready for our final speeches? Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so our order is going to be an overview on the disadvantage, then the disadvantage itself, and then the case. Is everybody ready? Okay. If we do the plan, NATO's already limited resources and strategic focus will be split between pandemic response and their main responsibility, preventing war against Russia. War with Russia is the biggest impact in the debate. It turns and outweighs the case on magnitude, timeframe, and risk, since tensions with Russia are already high and the likelihood of another COVID-19 this soon is very low. All it takes is one accidental or intentional act of aggression by Russia, and we will need every available resource for NATO, or we will all die as World War III goes nuclear. That's our Schlosser evidence. The DISAD turns the case. If we allow the situation with Russia to escalate, all of NATO's resources will be diverted, and the AF's investment will be worthless. We'll be stuck with both an underprepared NATO and an underdeveloped pandemic response infrastructure. The AF is the worst of both worlds and will make racial health inequality worse by stealing resources currently directed towards domestic pandemic relief in these communities in favor of an organization that will help Western Europe first, on the DISAD. Our only answer on the DISAD is that there is no trade-off because we are already signaling strength. But there is trade-off. Our Cesaroli evidence is the most recent and says that currently NATO doesn't have enough resources to signify that their strength against Russia. We need to show a commitment with our allies. On the case, they say that there was no nuclear war, but our DISAD has a nuclear war impact. And that is why you make sure your timer is working before your speech. A minute and 15 seconds. Oh, yeah, I did not hear the button press and I looked at it. There's no way I have this much time. I think I pushed it on.
All right. Overview. Case. DISAD. Does anybody need that again? Overview. Case. DISAD. A straight concession on the disadvantage and a basically conceded risk of case means it impossible for you to not vote affirmative. Completely conceded risk and time framing also outweigh. First is risk. COVID proves a high propensity for new pathogens to arise. They've conceded from the levy evidence that pathogens that are killer are coming now and is only a risk of global collective responses to prevent them. Next is time frame. Globalization and COVID proves pandemic responses and pandemic spread is rapid and inevitably will threaten the entirety of the globe absent any sort of any sort of response. The only argument here is no nuclear war, sure, but you don't get to access extinction framing because none of your cards say extinction. Go to the DISAD. A completely misrepresented link scenario and a faulty internal link make the entire risk of this DISAD minimal. First, there's no turns case. Evidence indicates we won't spend on pandemics during a war, and we get to durably fiat them going to the plan. But only our evidence speaks to the ability for NATO to deter. Their cards say, sure, the AF would trade off with physical military resources, but none of their cards say that has any actual terminal impact on deterrence. That means deterrence is inevitable because regardless of physical military capacity, we are still perceived as strong because of A, domestic military capabilities, and B, the fact that we still spend a ton on NATO. That means that the COVID example that Amit tried to bring up is an AF argument because they've conceded from the Jovic evidence that during COVID, we were still perceived as a deterrent force and Russia didn't try to attack us until recently, which means there's only a risk that we prevent pandemics and prevent a completely conceded racism scenario when there's no risk of DISAD.
of our debaters did an awesome job in this demo debate. So we saw on both sides how they tried to wrap things up for us by arguing why they're the most important in terms of Mr. T, our magnitude, risk, and time frame for why their impact is the thing that we should care the most about. So some things that I want you all to think about as you fill out your ballots are, you might be like, well, okay, who do I choose based on all that? Like, it's not just like, who spoke prettier or who you thought, just sounded nice, but some things to think about are, do you think the affirmative actually solves the harms of their case? So they talked about disease and pandemics being things that the affirmative plan would solve. Do you think, based on the way everything was argued in this debate, that the affirmative would actually solve those things? And I guess also because of how the negative is framed, like, do you think the plan is necessary to solve those things versus just using the status quo, which again is just our debate word for the way things are now, the way the world is now, and you might have heard that also referenced as SQUO in the debate. SQUO is just a shortening of status quo. And then for the negative side, they have this disadvantage, and the question is, do you think, based on the arguments, that the disadvantage scenario they present about deterrence and nuclear war with Russia would actually happen if we did the plan? So, would it happen if we did the plan, nuclear war with Russia? Would we actually solve diseases and racial justice if we do the plan, are kind of the things you should ask about if they all have proved their impacts. And then, once you've thought about that, and if you're like, yeah, I think both those things are right, they both are doing a really good job of presenting their impacts and proving that voting for them is the only way to avoid those impacts, you can think about kind of the Mr. T that they use. So both sides talked about magnitude, risk, and time frame. So both of them made cases for why one might be more important than the other. So on the affirmative, we had arguments about how risk and time frame are the most important things because they have an impact that we're seeing the effects of now, and how we shouldn't care about magnitude because of the magnitude of the negative impact because of the specifics of their evidence. And then on the negative side, we had arguments about how they outweigh on kind of all three, both just because, there's arguments about how nuclear war could kill us all, which the affirmative contests. There's arguments about how the risk of war with Russia because of tensions might be higher versus how likely it is we'll have another pandemic, and then kind of how quickly would a nuclear war happen versus how quickly would we see another pandemic, or how quickly would we be able to actually solve some racism. All right, so John, I saw your hand.
Oh, my hand was up.
Oh, okay, lots of stretching today. All right, so those are some kind of things to consider. It's all right if you're like, that's a lot of stuff to consider. You all don't have to, answer all of those questions in like hyper-specific detail. Those are just some things that some judges think about. But yeah, Rain? Sorry?
Oh, you're keeping them with you when you go to lab?
Yeah, so you're going to take the ballots. Yeah. So y'all are all going to make decisions. You're going to fill them out, but you're going to discuss them with your lab leaders, and you all as a lab are going to vote on who you think won this debate.
I'll also let you know that there's no clear right or wrong answer. Debate is not math. There's no, this is an absolute wrong answer. So if you and your friends or the rest of your lab don't necessarily agree, as long as you can explain why you voted the way you did, that's the right answer.
So are there any kind of final questions about anything that you all saw in this debate? Either just like how it progressed, like the structure of the debate, the order that everyone spoke in, or anything about any of the arguments that you all want to ask the group now?
I think they'll ask their lab leaders.
All right, thanks
Also,
everyone.